Imagine being Sajid Javid, making the decision as Home Secretary to strip Shamima Begum of her British citizenship after she voluntarily travelled to Syria to join ISIS, watching that decision be upheld by the UK Supreme Court through multiple appeals, and then having the European Court of Human Rights waltz in and tell the British government that it needs to justify why it treated an ISIS bride as a security threat. That is exactly what has just happened, with the Strasbourg-based court formally telling the British Home Office that it must explain its decision to revoke Begum's citizenship, suggesting concerns that Britain might be using citizenship deprivation as punishment, and asking whether the government had duties or obligations to Begum as a possible victim of trafficking. Nigel Farage has absolutely lost it over this intervention, launching what can only be described as a blistering attack on the court, saying it is outrageous that a major decision like this of national interest can be made in the ECHR, declaring this shows why Britain must leave the court, and stating categorically that Begum must not be allowed back. This is not just another Brexit-adjacent argument about sovereignty. This is a fundamental clash over whether British courts should have the final say on who gets to be a British citizen, or whether European judges can override those decisions based on human rights interpretations that many British people find absurd. Quick favor. If you are absolutely gripped by this explosive controversy where European judges are questioning British decisions about ISIS members and Nigel Farage is calling it outrageous, hit that subscribe button right now. Over 94% of you watching have not subscribed yet. It is completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and helps us keep bringing you these moments where British sovereignty collides with European courts in the most dramatic fashion possible. Cheers if you did. Now back to this absolutely bonkers intervention. Let us start with who Shamima Begum is and why her case has become such a lightning rod for debates about citizenship, security, and Britain's relationship with European institutions. Begum was born in London and was 15 years old when she traveled to Syria in 2015 to join the terrorist organization Islamic State. She was not kidnapped. She was not tricked. She voluntarily left Britain to join a group that was at that very moment committing genocide, mass murder, sexual slavery, and unspeakable atrocities against religious minorities and anyone who opposed a barbaric interpretation of Islam. She married an Islamic convert named Yago Redijk and lived under ISIS rule for several years before the caliphate collapsed. In 2019, Sajid Javid, who was then Conservative Home Secretary, made the decision to revoke Begum's British citizenship on national security grounds. That decision was controversial at the time, with critics arguing that leaving someone stateless violated international law and that Begum should face trial in Britain rather than being abandoned in a Syrian refugee camp. But Javid's position was clear. Begum posed a threat to British security. She had voluntarily joined a terrorist organization, and allowing her to return would create unacceptable risks. The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom upheld Javid's decision through multiple appeals, ruling that while Begum had rights that deserved consideration, the security concerns were paramount and the Home Secretary's decision was lawful. That should have been the end of the matter. Britain's highest court had spoken, through multiple levels of appeal, and consistently ruled that the citizenship revocation was appropriate and legal. But now the European Court of Human Rights has decided to stick its nose in, formally telling the British Home Office that it needs to justify the decision and raising questions that suggest the court thinks Britain might have violated Begum's human rights. The ECHR suggested it had concerns that the Home Office was using the threat to deprive people of their citizenship as a punishment in certain cases, and asked whether the British government had duties or obligations to Begum as a possible victim of trafficking. That phrase, victim of trafficking, is doing an enormous amount of work and represents a fundamentally different interpretation of Begum's actions than most British people would accept. The trafficking framework is designed to protect people who are coerced, manipulated, or forced into situations against their will. Victims of trafficking are people who have crimes committed against them, not people who voluntarily travel to war zones to join terrorist organizations. The suggestion that Begum might be a victim of trafficking because she was 15 when she made a decision to join ISIS is an argument that infantilizes her agency and ignores the reality that plenty of 15-year-olds manage not to join genocidal death cults. Nigel Farage's response, speaking exclusively to the Daily Express, was characteristically blunt and uncompromising. It is outrageous that a major decision like this of national interest can be made in the ECHR, he said. It shows why we must leave. This is Farage in his element, taking a case that perfectly illustrates his long-standing argument about sovereignty and using it to make the case for Britain completely withdrawing from the European Court of Human Rights. The fact that a British Home Secretary made a decision, British courts at every level upheld that decision, and now European judges are questioning it and potentially preparing to overrule it. Plays directly into Farage's narrative about unaccountable foreign courts imposing their will on Britain. Farage's statement that Begum must not be allowed back is unequivocal and probably represents the view of the vast majority of British people. Polling has consistently shown that the public does not want Begum to return to Britain, viewing her as a security threat and as someone who made conscious choices to support a terrorist organization and should face the consequences. The idea that she might be allowed to re-enter the United Kingdom because European judges decided that her human rights were violated is genuinely alarming to people who remember the atrocities ISIS committed, and who do not think someone who voluntarily supported that organization deserves the protection of British citizenship. Begum is currently living in the Syrian Al-Roj detention camp, which houses thousands of former jihadists and their families. These camps are genuinely awful places with terrible living conditions, but they exist because multiple countries, including Britain, had decided that people who joined ISIS should not be allowed to return and potentially carry out attacks or spread extremist ideology. The camps are not ideal solutions, but they are responses to the genuine security threats that ISIS returnees pose. The European Court's intervention has once again ignited a furious debate over whether a foreign court should have any remit over British laws, particularly on matters of national security where the consequences of getting decisions wrong could be measured in British lives lost to terrorist attacks. The Home Office response was measured but firm, stating that the government will always protect the UK and its citizens. A spokesman added that Shamima Begum posed a national security threat, which is why she had her British citizenship revoked and is unable to return to the UK. They stated they will robustly defend any decision made to protect national security. That language, robustly defend, suggests the government is preparing for a legal battle with the ECHR and is not simply going to roll over and accept whatever the European judges decide. The question is whether that robust defense will actually succeed, or whether Britain will ultimately be forced to comply with whatever the ECHR rules. Begum's lawyers, predictably, have called the move by the ECHR an unprecedented opportunity, which tells you everything about how they see this intervention. They have lost at every level in British courts, so now they are hoping that European judges will give them the result they could not get domestically. This is exactly the kind of forum shopping that drives people mad about international human rights law. When you lose in your own country's courts, you go to international courts and hope they will overrule domestic decisions based on different interpretations of rights and obligations. The communication between the court and the Home Office will sound alarm bells that the ISIS bride could be allowed to re-enter the United Kingdom, despite successive governments stating they would not reinstate her citizenship. This is not just about Begum as an individual. This is about whether Britain has a sovereign right to make decisions about who is and is not entitled to British citizenship, particularly in national security cases. If the ECHR can force Britain to reinstate Begum's citizenship against the judgment of British courts and successive Home Secretaries, what other security decisions might European judges override in future? The fact that Sajid Javid's decision was upheld by the UK Supreme Court makes the ECHR intervention even more troubling from a sovereignty perspective. Britain's highest court, after hearing all the evidence and legal arguments, concluded that the citizenship revocation was lawful and appropriate. For an international court to then question that decision and potentially overrule it suggests a hierarchy where European courts sit above British courts, which is exactly what Brexit was supposed to end. Britain voted to leave the European Union partly to restore parliamentary sovereignty and the supremacy of British law. But the ECHR is separate from the EU, and Britain remains bound by its rulings unless we withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights entirely. The specific questions the ECHR asked are revealing about their thinking and concerns. They asked whether the deprivation of citizenship was analogous to a criminal prosecution, and whether it was a penalty within the meaning of Article 26 of the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings. This framing treats citizenship revocation as a punishment being imposed on Begum rather than as a security measure designed to protect the British public. The distinction matters because if it is a punishment, then Begum might have rights to various procedural protections and appeals that would not apply if it is simply an administrative decision about who qualifies for citizenship. They also asked whether Begum was at all material times within the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom, which is a technical legal question about whether British human rights obligations extend to someone who is physically in Syria but who was a British citizen. If the ECHR decide that Britain retained jurisdiction over Begum even after she traveled to Syria and joined ISIS, it could establish a precedent where British human rights obligations extend globally to anyone who was ever a British citizen regardless of their current location or actions. The question about whether the Secretary of State's decision engaged Begum's rights under Article 4 of the Convention goes to the heart of the trafficking argument. Article 4 prohibits slavery and forced labor, and the Convention on Action Against Trafficking creates obligations for states to protect victims of trafficking. If the ECHR accepts the argument that Begum was trafficked when she was recruited to travel to Syria at age 15, it would create obligations for Britain to protect her rather than treating her as a security threat.